Hey, I'm Hunt, and this is Hunt on LSU, your channel for LSU Fighting Tiger football talk. Enjoy the video. We want you to leave a comment below, hit that like button, and subscribe right below the video. Enjoy. We're rolling along here on 104.5 ESPN Baton Rouge. Brian Kelly just finished chatting with the big press room. There are a lot of different stops you make on a media day tour. Local TV, you got the ESPN guys, you've got a number of different places that you've got to hit, but the one that's always broadcast on television is the big ballroom with all the print media assembled, and he just got done with that. He was asked some questions about non-football things like AI and NIL and all kinds of stuff like that. He was also asked some questions about his football team. So I'll give you some of what I consider the high points here from Brian Kelly's chat for about 25, 30 minutes with the assembled writers. One quote that he talked on the football field that piqued my interest was about his quarterback, Jayden Daniels. And I'm sure you will hear Jayden say some of these things today as he makes his rounds as well up in Nashville. But one of the things that he was talking about was the progression of Jayden Daniels as a passer. And he said, look, the progression we saw over the course of the year was him stepping up in the pocket and making plays from the pocket as opposed to stepping up and immediately running. And that's the one where all the fans of LSU football and all this who pay attention to it, that's where all the bells and sirens go off. It's like he quits on the play and runs too quickly. And he's got great speed, and he's got great burst, and he's very productive when he runs the ball. But the strength of LSU's offense is the talent at wide receiver, and every time he tucks the ball and runs is a time that those guys are not getting the ball down the field with a chance to make a big play. So to me, it just kind of goes back to some of the things that we heard from Les Miles over the years and some of the things that we're now hearing from Brian Kelly. And I juxtapose them against each other and say that Les was reluctant to open things up and throw the football and do things differently. What drove us as fans and assembled media nuts was the simplicity of the offense and the toss dive to the left and refusing to get with the tempo and the space and all that was coming very rapidly to college football. And the quote that Haney always goes back to, and famous one from Les, was the engine's pretty stinking good, talking about Leonard Fournette and the talk, entering that junior season of Leonard Fournette that started up in Wisconsin that ended up being the last year for Les Miles, was you got to throw the ball. You got to open things up. You've got to do things a little bit more differently. And they get up to Wisconsin, and the first 3 plays were handoffs to Leonard Fournette. And they didn't do anything differently. And while I think our concern is that Jayden Daniels has got to take some more chances and get the ball down the field, Brian Kelly's quotes are the opposite of what Les was saying. Like, we know. We want to do this. It's very much a point of emphasis in this offseason. That was obvious in Brian Kelly's comments late last year when they said, well, he didn't have any interceptions. And BK's like, yeah, he didn't have any interceptions, but like, is that a good thing? Does that mean we're not taking chances that we need to take and giving our players opportunities? And I go back to like the Florida game where LSU last year was just, clicking on all cylinders. They scored on their first 6 drives. And there were balls that were thrown up and given receivers a chance. And Brian Thomas goes and makes a play in the end zone. And Malik Neighbors goes and makes a play. And we know that Brian Kelly wants to see more of that. So it should give you a little comfort as a fan to hear what he's saying. Like, look, we're trying to coach this guy to step up in the pocket, not to get out of there and run, to keep his eyes down the field and make the throws. If that piece comes, and it comes routinely, he did it at times last year, just not quite enough. But if that piece comes, LSU's offense becomes an absolute nightmare. You've got NFL guys on the offensive front. You've got studs out wide. You've got a veteran quarterback who started a ton of games, who's got great speed, and all these weapons around him. It's really difficult to manage as a defensive coordinator. I listened to Greg McElroy earlier today, and I'll get back to Brian Kelly in a second, but this kind of led me into this direction. I was listening to the SC Network earlier today. For those of you that were at work and obviously can't listen to SC Media Days all day, Greg McElroy said this when they were talking about LSU. He said they might have the best offensive line in the SEC. They might have the best wide receiving core in the SEC. They might have the best quarterback in the SEC. They might have the best interior defensive lineman in the SEC, and they might have the best defensive player in the SEC. That's coming from Greg McElroy. And that should carry some weight with it. He's on air every day in Alabama. He works for the SC Network. He's Football 365. He's got a pretty good idea of what LSU's got. And for him to say that all those units might be the best in the league tells you kind of where this team is. And it actually counteracts what Brian Kelly said today, which is the next quote I wanted to get to from BK. I'm sure Matt will have all this cut up later today. But Brian Kelly said today that I wrote it down, so I don't know if it's exact, but it's pretty close because I was listening and just writing. He said, "We will have a football roster that will be able to compete against Georgia." Is that right now? No, it's not. But it will be. And again, that is an odd quote because Media Days is sunshine and rainbows. Media Days is possibilities and projectability and optimism. We've got a great team. This guy's going to have this year. This guy's going to break out. This is a returning star. Like, there's just not a lot of pessimism this time of year. Y'all have heard a million times me talk about the calendar in college sports, specifically college football. And for him to, again, double down on a quote that we heard from him a couple weeks ago and say pretty directly, we're not ready to compete with Georgia, surprises me. And he knows more than me. He knows more football than me, and he certainly knows his personnel better than I do. But the team looks pretty good to me. They don't have to beat Georgia 10 times. If they got to Atlanta, they'd have to beat them once. And so it's an odd message to send, in my opinion, because that's all we're doing here in Media Days is kind of sending messages to your players that could read that quote and say, you're not ready to beat Georgia. Now, I guess theoretically, you don't have to be ready to beat Georgia in July, and you might have to be ready to beat them in December or January. And maybe you could connect the dots and say when February or when December or January rolls around, now you're ready. You weren't ready in July when I said that. But he didn't have to go that far with the quote. So it caught my attention for him to say, we're not ready to compete with Georgia. If Clark Lee gets up there and says that, I'll nod my head. Even if Shane Beamer wants to say that, I'll say, okay. But I don't expect to hear that from Josh Heupel or Nick Saban or Brian Kelly. I don't expect to hear that from Jimbo Fisher. But we did hear that from Brian Kelly today because he was asked about, again, the gap between Georgia and the rest of the SEC, and he said we're not ready to beat Georgia, which I thought was interesting. The last piece that I want to touch on before I get to Greg Sankey's thoughts at the top of SEC Media Days was asked about Mason Smith and what he could do to help the defense. And this is a point that I've kind of harped on the last couple of weeks as we started to dip our toe into football. And this is an X and O deal, and this is something I talked about last week, but Brian Kelly said last year after Mason Smith got hurt, and maybe postseason, that he just would change the way the defense works. And he went back to that line of thinking today when he was talking to media, and he said, last year we didn't have a guy in the middle that won a lot of one-on-ones. Obviously, Jaquelin Roy had a nice year. Now I'm not using Brian Kelly quotes. That was a Brian Kelly quote that we didn't have a lot of guys in the middle that won a lot of one-on-ones. And then he said, and I would add on to that, I would say, yeah, Jaquelin Roy had a nice year, and Mekhi Wingo had a really solid year that garnered some postseason recognition. But if you hear Brian Kelly talk, it's very clear he sees Mason Smith as a cut above everybody else they've got on the defensive front. And the quote that he gave today was, Mason will win those one-on-one matchups, which means you're going to have to put a second person in there, which means the numbers work to LSU's favor on the edges. Makes a ton of sense. But again, I'm not capable right now of going back and looking at game tape from Mason Smith's freshman year and projecting what he's going to be 2 years down the road, which is what it's going to be next month. But it sounds like, based on what Mason Smith did in fall camp last year, that he's a massive difference maker for the LSU defense. And BK believes that. And that's huge, because you start having to divert enough attention to Mason Smith, you're not paying enough attention to Mekhi Wingo. You're not paying enough attention to Harold Perkins. That's where you get into a problem. So for me, with Brian Kelly today, 3 things that stood out. Talking about Jayden Daniels and how he's being coached to sit in there and take shots down the field. The football team not being ready to compete against Georgia, even though it looks pretty good to me. And then Mason Smith continues to draw effusive praise from the coaching staff, and it feels like that's a guy who might change the way they do things on defense, which is exciting. Hey, thanks for watching Hunt on LSU. Before you get out of here, do us a couple of favors. Hit that like button, leave your comments below, and subscribe to the channel for all your Fighting Tiger football talk. See you next time.